Hello, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Caitlin Heath, and I'm the Associate Director of Communications and Events at the French American Chamber of Commerce, New York chapter. We are happy to welcome you to today's session, The Democratization of Empathy, COVID-19 as the Great Equalizer. This event is made possible thanks to our Human Resources and Mobility Committee members who help produce and engage with our audience in this sector. We'd like to give a quick shout out to some of them who might be listening in today. Our committee chair, Emmanuel Cargill, Pierre-Georges Bonfils, Michel Buffet, Brian Heron, Megan Stradley, Violetta Dubowski, Swazig Travillon, Christina Cure, and Guillaume Lafage. Thanks for all your input. Now I am pleased to welcome our guests, Joseph K. West and Sonya Sepahban, who you see on the screen with me now. Before we launch in and let them take the floor, just a quick word about our organization for any new participants. The French American Chamber of Commerce's mission is to provide the networks and opportunities, experiences, and understanding that empowers successful business relationships between and for members. Members have complimentary access to webinars featuring top industry talent, as well as personalized member-to-member introductions, and of course, access to the FACC member directory and our newly revamped member portal and Career Connect. Before we fully begin, a few housekeeping tips to take care of. This webinar will last approximately 45 minutes with discussion format, followed by room for questions at the end. As attendees, you can type questions while the presentation is underway. Please make full use of that, and we will circle back, or Sonya may choose to answer them as we're going on. Now I'm pleased to turn the floor over to Sonya, our moderator.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. Welcome again to the French American Chamber of Commerce New York chapter's fireside chat on what our guest, Joe West here, has called the democratization of empathy and COVID-19 as the great equalizer. What a great title. We'll explore the post-George Floyd era in terms of corporate responsibility, what effect the social justice movement has had on it, and what it will look like in the future. Just a bit short about myself in the way of introduction. I'm Sonya Sepahban, I started my career as a NASA engineer and later was an executive at Fortune 500 companies, where one of my other duties as assigned was to lead our diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, or what we call DEI for short. And I must admit, I had limited success, which is why I'm now the CEO of OurOffice, where we have pioneered the only end-to-end solution for DEI. We call it D&I as a service, and we built it for the hundreds of thousands of small and medium businesses in the US alone, who really want a more inclusive workplace, but need their professional expertise, proven process, software platform, data, and so on. We provide all that in an affordable subscription-based package. I also sit on public company boards where DEI is certainly a hot topic these days. So I have several types of intersections with DEI. But enough about me. I'd like to welcome our guest again, Joe West. Hello, Joe.
Sonya, how are you?
I am good. I'm good. Thank you. As I said in our call last week to you, I've been really looking forward to our conversation today. I couldn't wait. In all of my conversations that I've been fortunate to have, especially recently on panels, keynotes, or more intimate settings like this, I have not met with someone who has the unique combination of perspectives that you bring. You are a trial lawyer at Duane Morris, practicing in the area of complex litigation, handling a variety of matters. So long list, but I'm going to try to remember some of them, but I was very impressed. They include class actions, insurance litigation, commercial litigation, zoning and land use, catastrophic injury, products liability, and so on. But you're also a member of your firm's partners board and serve as the firm's chief diversity and inclusion officer. You also manage Duane Morris's comprehensive firm-wide diversity and inclusion program and chair your consulting practice around diversity and inclusion. Last but not least, I found myself, and of course, reading some of your writings, you're quite eloquent in talking about your lived and living experience as a person of color in our country today. And your writings have been picked up by global authorities like Le Monde. So let's start with your journey with that impressive background. Tell us, how did you get to where you are and this unique combination of skills and expertise in DEI that you bring to your firm and your profession, which I might mention, as we've talked about, it is still sadly one of the least diverse among white collar professions.
Sonya, first of all, thank you so much. I want to start by thanking the French American Chamber of Commerce, of course, the committee that is spearheading this particular program. I want to also give a shout out to one of my partners at Duane Morris, Pierre Bonfil, who arranged this particular endeavor for myself, and of course to you. I'm so thoroughly impressed with you and your background. You've been a trailblazer, particularly in an area that has not enjoyed a lot of diversity in STEM and the sciences, and you continue to do work. So thank you so much. I'm honored to be with you today. I will talk briefly just about my background in answer to your question, but I do want us to focus on the topic at hand. I spent a good part of my career in-house, almost a decade with Entergy Corporation. It's E-N-T-E-R-G-Y. Entergy is a Fortune, I think, 120 utility company based in New Orleans. It does so much of its litigation in-house. I gained a great deal of litigation experience, and as a result was recruited to Walmart, where I spent 5 years in-house at Walmart. Part of that time in the, as you mentioned, the class action complex litigation group, and a good part of it as the head of the outside counsel management function, where I was responsible for helping to manage the company's relationships with its outside firms globally. In that role, I gained an understanding and an appreciation for the business case for diversity. As Walmart's outside counsel ranks became more diverse, I saw an increase in the quality of the work that was being done by those outside firms, by those outside lawyers. And it actually helped illustrate for me in a very meaningful way the fact that the concepts of diversity and inclusion and excellence are not mutually exclusive. In fact, quite the opposite. They are sort of interdependent on each other. And I saw that even more so during the time that I spent as the CEO of the Minority Corporate Counsel Association, where I had the opportunity to engage in a very meaningful way with both law firms and corporate entities in the same vein. And I think we are at the point now where I believe people should, if they haven't already gained an appreciation for it, have an understanding of the fact that there is a business case for diversity and inclusion, that it actually inures to the benefit of all of us to take this issue seriously and to make sure that we take steps to eradicate barriers to inclusion and advancement for the entirety of our workforce.
Oops, sorry. I love sharing, your personal experience with it, right? Because there have been many reports by major industry authorities, like Deloitte and BCG and so on about, the benefits. But I think for each firm, each organization, it's a little bit like, does that really apply to us? So I'm really glad that you start by sharing your own experience. I've had the same experience. But as you say, today it's more visible than ever. So I want to bring us to the post George Floyd era now. In a piece that you wrote about a year ago, you talked about having the talk with your sons, which happens more often these days. You described one instance that really stayed with me. It's after watching disturbing videos with your sons. I want to read, I wrote this down so I could read it, what you said, because it really brought tears to my eyes. It's the human side of everything that we're talking about. You said very eloquently, in recalling the looks on their faces after we watched each of these episodes, and each time we have spoken of them since, I envision myself on a tightrope. I teeter between equipping my flesh and blood with the appropriate sense of wariness that may save their lives, while I risk allowing the reality of racism to smear their finely honed and well-built psyches with the stench of self-doubt. Explain and tell us more about that experience, and please connect it with how that links with your responsibilities as a professional and subject matter expert as well.
Thank you for asking that question. And I should add, I'm actually on vacation with my boys right now, which is the reason why I look so unpolished. And they're at the pool at the resort we're staying at now. So there's a better than even chance that they will come bursting into the room. So
we'll meet them then. That's fine.
You're fair warned. Yeah, so I wrote that actually came from an article that I wrote that was originally published, I think, on law.com and across the ALM platform called The Talk. And it was eventually picked up. And then, as you mentioned, Le Monde did a more comprehensive interview with me about this issue. It was post George Floyd. I was watching the horrific video of the torture and murder of George Floyd with my boys. And I stopped watching the video and started watching them and their reactions. Um, and it recalled in me a conversation that my brothers and I had with my father so many years ago, where he was talking to us about um, what it meant to be a person of color, particularly a Black man, in a place where even the most benign of interactions, whether it's with authority figures or just people out in society, could go from benign to lethal at a moment's notice. And I had hoped that the sort of generational toxicity that came from conversations like that wouldn't be passed on to my boys. But in that moment of watching them watch that video, I learned that in fact it probably would be. And so the challenge is to make sure that uh, they understand their value, their worth as human beings, while at the same time making sure that they do understand that specter of lethality is out there. And if they're not aware of it, then have I done my job as a parent? And so it's really challenging, and it is a tightrope. And when I wrote that, it was because I was in that moment of realization that they were having a moment of realization. And to be frank with you, Sonya, it made me sad.
Yeah.
And I wanted to capture and express that and share it, and I did.
Well, it made me very sad too as I was reading it. I'm sure all the other readers of it. How old are your boys, by the way?
They're teenagers. They're now 18 and 16. And of course, a year or so ago, well, they just made 18 and 16. So they were, I think, 14 and 16 at the time.
Yeah. Well, what a really horrific thing for kids at that age to have to watch.
Yeah.
You have, as we said earlier, you've called COVID-19 the great equalizer, and that the George Floyd killing, democratized empathy. Let's talk about that. What do you mean? How does that really show up?
Yeah, so the title actually is counterintuitive in a lot of ways, because one of the things that COVID-19 did was illustrate in so many other ways the absolute absence of equality. If you look at the disparities in healthcare, disparities in housing opportunities, even things as fundamental as hunger, we've seen that COVID actually and the pandemic itself actually revealed a lot of disparities. But specifically in the area of an understanding and appreciation for the impact of some of the lack of equity, lack of opportunities from a racial justice standpoint, I think COVID actually helped us understand and appreciate what that empathy looked like. And here's what I mean by that. Um, what happened to George Floyd is not novel, sadly. It's not unique. George Floyd was not the first person of color, not the first African American to be tortured and killed in such a grisly fashion. There were a couple of things, I think, though, that set that particular incident apart and caused it to become a catalyst for change that really resonated in a global fashion, to be honest with you. And I think the fact that it occurred during the pandemic was one of the reasons for that. I think most people of color, particularly African Americans, have always understood what it feels like, as I mentioned earlier, to have sort of like the specter of lethality hanging over them, the sort of background noise that something tragic might happen just going to the grocery store. One thing the pandemic did was help all of us understand what that feels like. Perhaps for the first time ever, every single person in the world understood what it felt like to really have, even for a moment, the question pop into their heads when they stepped out of their homes, that through no fault of their own, something lethal, something tragic could possibly happen to them. And I think that created in us sort of a democratization of empathy, such that when what happened with George Floyd did in fact happen, and of course, there's the fact that all of us were at home and we could collectively see what was going on as part of the news. I think what that did, that sort of democratization of empathy, that baseline of an understanding and an appreciation for the first time, that what that feels like, propelled to people's consciousness sort of a really fundamental understanding of what it might feel like to walk a mile in someone else's shoes for the first time. And I think that's one of the reasons why that incident, more than any other, sort of allowed people for the first time to stop and think and question what inequity looks like, what inequitable treatment looks like, and how is it manifesting itself throughout various institutions to which we all fall heir. And I think that's what I mean by the democratization of empathy, that for the first time, perhaps ever in a lot of people's lives, we could look and see what it felt like to be in other people's shoes. And look, the question becomes, how sustainable is that? I think we see evidence that there might be some sustainability to it. For example, you look at some of the horrific hate crimes that have befallen our brothers and sisters in the Asian community, especially in some cities. And I think people who might not necessarily belong to a particular group are looking at things that are happening to other groups and saying, that's not right, that's not fair, and something should be done about that. But on the other hand, there's a bit of a pendulum swing, a bit of a reaction to that sort of one of the things that came from 2020, which was a kind of a collective ownership and a recognition of a collective ownership of issues of addressing issues of equity or the lack thereof. And it begs the question, how sustainable are these efforts, particularly when you look at what's happening in institutions, whether it's corporations, law firms, government. That really is the question that's confronting us right now.
Yeah, it's one of the things that surprised me was how surprised some people acted, about this. Like you said, it's not new, right?
Yeah.
I've had girlfriends who are moms and wives, and they always tell me, they're African American, and they always have told me, I mean, throughout the last 25 years that I've been friends, for example, with one of my friends has always been sharing. I've had calls from her saying, well, my son didn't show up, I'm really worried. And it's like, I'm like, well, it's only been like 15 minutes,
Yeah.
like we're out together or something. Yeah. And so it's, they talk about these stories. So I think it depends on your experiences, your circle of friends and so on. But even now, as you said, I think the danger is, how sustainable this is. And so today we, of course, want to talk a little bit about, how does that show up in the workplace, right? And what role do companies, firms, organizations play in this, right? There is some data out there that says over 80% of Americans now expect their company, they expect companies in general should have a position and should take actions on social issues. We have, we have customers. We have, I was very surprised. We have a small, incredibly successful firm, for example, that has a large Asian population, and so when we're doing some initial work with them, we talked to the Asian, population. This was exactly during the time that you mentioned, when the issues were going on there. or at least had surfaced there, I should say, because the issues are always going on. But basically, the Asian employees had not said anything about it at work, and nobody had asked them. Nobody had asked, the next day when they came to work, and after the killings there, how do you feel about that? I mean, when you see somebody that looks just like you, has gone through this, it's traumatic in a different way than you see someone that you don't really identify with, or you have no connection to that community, right? And it turns out that really having a little bit of a conversation around that, and again, each organization is different, doesn't mean that you have to spend. I mean, people kind of go between the extremes, right? It's like, well, we can't just, we have business to do. We can't, well, you don't have to stop your business.
Right.
it could be just 10 minutes at the beginning of a meeting. The next day you're showing up. It's not all or nothing.
That's right.
So I'm wondering how you think of that, and especially even at your firm at Duane Morris. What were the key elements of the response to George Floyd or the Asian community, hate crimes that happened?
So what I saw after George Floyd happened is that a lot of organizations fell into one of two categories. You either had entities that had a meaningful approach to diversity and inclusion already, and saw this as an opportunity to expand upon that work. But you had a lot of entities that had either a nascent to completely non-existent approach to this issue, hadn't really thought much about it. You mentioned the diversity consulting practice at our firm that I helped lead. We had a number of entities that we were already doing work for that said, okay, Joe, let's engage, let's figure out how we can really, really work within our organization to do better and increase our work. And you literally had there are new clients of ours, I won't name any, who really literally reached out. I had conversations at the board level, at the CEO level, heads of HR, general counsels who would say, we haven't done anything. I literally had one CEO say, what's this diversity stuff I keep hearing about? And that just, it just blows your mind. It's like you realize, okay, we've got our work cut out for us. It's an opportunity. But at the same time, you say to yourself, where have you been? And so I think what you're seeing and what you saw early on was a few things. First of all, there is, and I apologize for the phone ringing.
Okay.
There's a couple of things happening that'll continue to happen. First of all, there's just, what I'll call the weight of demographic inevitability. Particularly in the US, even though the legal profession is the least diverse of all white collar professions, every census report that comes out every few years shows that the country is becoming more diverse. African Americans, Asian Americans, Latino Americans, these are the fastest growing demographic populations. And what that means is that eventually it's going to translate into a true understanding in the workplace of how and why these issues are important. The other thing that's happening rapidly, and I think this has been accelerated because of what happened last year, is what I'll call the shrinking accountability buffer. It used to be that if you were at the top of the food chain in any sort of corporate entity, there was a bit of a buffer of accountability between the decisions that you were making at the C-suite or the board level and sort of like the lower tier stakeholders, like your employees or, the people who might have been your customer base. You were certainly answerable to them in some remote sort of way, but there wasn't the need for some instant policy nimbleness like there is now. The fact of the matter is there is no longer an accountability buffer between the decision-making that happens at the top of the food chain and the people who matter, which truly are your stakeholders, both internal and external stakeholders, no matter at what level they happen to be. There is an instantaneous sort of means of communicating grievances now that requires policy nimbleness. And the third thing that's important is, people are expecting the organizations to which they have some allegiance, whether as customers, employees, or in any other fashion, to have some fluency around issues of diversity and equity. You mentioned that I'm on the management committee at our firm, the Partners Board, which is the managing body of the firm. I also engage in recruiting and hiring, both recruiting and getting work in from clients, but also employees, associates, partners, laterals. And what I see now is something that I hadn't seen 5, 10 years ago, and that is this. People are making decisions about whether they want to be associated with your organization based on how serious you are about this issue. And that's not just limited to diverse individuals. You have non-diverse individuals who will ask questions about, what are you doing around diversity and inclusion? What are your practices? What are your policies? What types of equity are you engaged with? And I think what that signals is that despite the sort of pendulum swings, these issues are going to have to continue to be manifest if you want to continue to do business in this country.
Yeah, I love how you put it, the accountability buffer. I'm going to steal that and use it. I
Feel
love
free.
that. We were on a couple of years ago, before all of this, I was on a panel that, NACD, the National Association of Corporate Directors, had assembled a few of us, and it was about, the board of the future. The board composition is always a big topic. What do you do? And one of the things that came to my mind, and I shared at that time, and I think now is really a big point you're making, is that, the board in the future, and even now, really has to be representative of your constituencies, because as board members, we often just, we hire good consultants, we have access to a lot of good advice, but there's no time. There's not time to go hire somebody else. So you better have, all the different kinds of expertise, whether it's from cyber to, reputation management, and branding and this sort of thing, but also, HR on your board. Some of the, kind of experiences and expertise that in the past might not have been as much sought out, because you got to make these, you got to call a board meeting right away. I think many companies had emergency board meetings, not just after COVID, but also after George Floyd. And the other point that you make that I really like to highlight is that, there's no longer, just occurred to me as you were talking, there are no longer any bystanders. People have a position, and that includes your employees. We've had customers come to us because, for example, mission-driven nonprofits, we have great customers that, from that sector. And they come to us and they go, our employees are protesting outside. And they wrote a letter, an open letter to our board. And they're so caught off guard because they're mission-driven, they're nonprofits, they have great mission. Their beneficiaries are really important to them. A lot of times the beneficiaries are very diverse, but inside the company or the firm or the nonprofit, they forget that it's about how they behave as well. And we've had other people just decide, oh, we can handle this. We have somebody who looks the part, right? They grab, someone, you, me, somebody, that has some degree of apparent, visible diversity. And they say, well, what do you think we should do? And I'll tell you, we've had people have come to us because it has backfired. They put out a statement, or they did or said something that make matters worse and led to a protest. And then we have those who came to us and said, for the Black History Month, we're thinking of doing this. Like, we're thinking of, this is real case, we're thinking of, having a panel with our African-American employees, for Black History Month. And we say, so did you ask them? Did you ask them how they would feel about that?
Exactly.
And they go, well, that's a good idea. So they go and ask them. And then the people say, absolutely not. we don't want to be singled out and put on a panel and be put under this pressure, right? It's like the underrepresented get to do the job, right? They get additional responsibilities. A, and B, we don't think this should be the only day. This isn't like we're African-American or we're, female or whatever, whatever the diversity is, all year long. It's not
Yeah.
just this one day or this one month.
And
So it's just so much about, true inclusion is really including people in these kind of decisions as well. And then also expertise, like they come, for example, to your firm or with our customers, it's just inform yourself in some way, educate yourself. There's a lot of resources out there.
well, that's right. And see, what you just illustrated is, I think, the reason why issues of diversity and equity and inclusion have to be a part of the DNA of the organization. The fact of the matter is, listen, every organism on the planet is motivated by self-interest.
Yeah.
And to the extent you can make people understand how and why this is in their own self-interest, then it becomes really, really a no-brainer. There is a study that I think Citigroup put out. I'd looked it up before this call. The article that I first noticed was September 23rd of last year in Money Watch. It was a study that Citigroup did that showed that racism has cost the US 16 trillion in GDP over the last 20 years. So in the first 20 years of the century, racism has cost the US 16 trillion in GDP. Something like 113 billion has been attributable to educational inequities, housing inequities, 218 billion. The lack of access to capital for Black and people of color from an entrepreneurial standpoint, 13 trillion. And then the study also says that if we work to close the inequity gaps, it would result in a $5 trillion increase in GDP for the next 5 years. Okay, now if you think about that, that means actually taking a systemic approach to eliminating barriers, increasing opportunity across the board, and taking bias, taking racism out of the economic ecosystem benefits everyone. and so, once people understand that, I think, look, as a threshold matter, that is an excellent starting point to helping address some of these issues. And Sonya, someone, if you don't mind, I noticed that in the Q&A, someone has posed a question, which, if you don't mind us maybe taking a look at that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Let me go there and see. They say, for companies that may not have the budget to hire expert consultants to help create D&I strategy, what are some easy first steps they can take on their own?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. And so here's what I will give you. I think, look, this is contrary to my own self-interest because I work as a consultant for a lot of companies, but what's even more important to me is helping people pollinate these ideas. So here's what I would say. It certainly helps if, regardless of the size of your company, there is a commitment from the top that is crucial and critical. So I hope that that's the case where you are. The other thing I would recommend is have not necessarily a diversity and inclusion committee do this work, because Sonya, one of the things you just alluded to is oftentimes the diversity and inclusion committee, or even the diverse individuals, however many there may be, are saddled with the work, the responsibility for doing the work. I would say get the leadership of the organization to put together a strategic plan working group focused on diversity and inclusion, and to focus on 4 key areas. The first is what I call inventory. Just taking a look at where you are. Take inventory of what has been done up to this point. It might surprise you that some things have been done, but if in fact nothing's been done, then take a look at what else others are doing. What some of your peer organizations are doing, what some of the more successful endeavors are out there in the ecosystem. So just take inventory. That's number one. Secondly is information. Look at the infrastructure for communicating the importance of diversity and inclusion throughout the entirety of all the ranks of the organization. There has to be some means of communicating what you're doing, whether it's a newsletter or some regular communications from the leadership. But yeah, if not, then you really won't have the ability to make sure that there's some sustainability about the work that's done. So inventory, information. Thirdly is accountability. There's a saying that what gets measured gets done. And the fact is, if there are no accountability measures tethered to that commitment from leadership, then there really won't be much sustainability about whatever it is that you're going to do. Every other important business metric is measured, and then people in leadership are either rewarded or not based on the extent to which what's being measured is getting done. The same thing should be the case from a diversity and inclusion standpoint. And then finally, so there's inventory, information, accountability, and the fourth piece is business case. Regardless of whatever type of entity you are, whether it's a corporation, law firm, nonprofit, educational institution, you are engaged in a business endeavor. The business may look different, your business objectives may be different, but regardless of what it is that you're doing, figure out the extent to which a meaningful approach to diversity and inclusion helps facilitate your business objectives, and look at the best ways to marry those two things. So to me, that's low-hanging fruit. You can accomplish this without a consultant. You can put together a committee of people who are equipped to sort of engage in these particular areas and go to work.
Yeah, I love that answer. It's so specific and action oriented, so people can really do something about it. I want to highlight what you said about the business case. When we work with our customers, and the first thing we do is focus on what are your just strategic priorities and your business drivers. Every organization, as you said, whether it's nonprofit or for-profit, publicly traded or not, and they have some usually a 12-month, five-year, they have different kind of plans. Just go to that and pull out the 3 or 4 or 5. Invariably it's something about expanding markets, improving the bottom line, improving the top line, whatever it is. If you think about it really strategically, you will find a connection to diversity and equity and inclusion. And I'll tell you why it's so important. I worked for about 6 years, 6.5 years on improving diversity, equity, and inclusion in my last big corporate role. And this was born out of the fact that, when I came, I was the first diversity hire at the firm, at the organization, in terms of, very senior levels of, in the C-suite. And we did some great things, which frankly, a great team, I was just fortunate to be associated with them. But there was some credit given to the fact that, well, here we have our first diversity hire in our 50-year history, right? And then all of a sudden we do some things differently. I was in aerospace and defense, so Pentagon got interested in it. So naturally, we all started paying attention, and we did a lot of great things towards it. We spent a lot of time and resources. One of my biggest regrets is that I didn't do what I just said well. And so what happened is, and this isn't just, one isolated case, right? I have personal experience with it, but BCG did a study. They talked to over 16,000 employees at different companies, I assume mostly their own clients. So about 97% of them had some kind of a D&I effort going on. But when they talked to the targeted population that was supposed to benefit from those efforts, only 25% said that they actually benefited from their organization's D&I efforts. Now that's a terrible outcome, right? 25%. Wow. And the reason is, again, I think it's because we don't know what you said, we're not really measuring, we're not taking inventory, we're not really informed about what the low-hanging fruit is, but also the sustainability of it. A lot of times, when I left that organization, we made some progress, but within a couple of years, everything had unraveled. And it wasn't because anybody tried to unravel it, actively. It was just the way that, it wasn't connected with those business objectives. So I just can't really emphasize enough that what the point that you made about the business case, connecting it with the strategy and with what the organization really, really cares about. And as you said, you can't really wait this out. There is, the workforce profile is shifting. It is majority, the millennials and Gen Zers are majority diverse now, and they will be 75% of the working population by 2025.
Well, and not only that, that's a very good point. I'm glad you mentioned that. They also are steeped in these issues in much the same way that they are steeped in technology in a way that generations before them were not. And I think those two things go hand in hand. What it shows is that a lot of the issues that confront them and which they confront are shared in a much more rapid way. And I think, again, contributes to the sort of shrinking of that accountability buffer in the organizations to which they belong. And that's going to continue. That combined with sort of like the demographic changes and, like I said, the weight of sort of demographic inevitability. One of the questions that appears in the Q&A has to do with sort of like backlashes. If there's some sort of backlash for a lot of the work that's being done. I think instead of sort of a backlash on any sort of company by company basis, I see a lot of politicization of the issue. But to be frank with you, the pendulum always swings back and forth whenever there's progress being made on any particular issue. But I think there is a certain inevitability about this. Dr. King was quoted oftentimes as saying that the arc of the moral universe may be steep, but it bends towards justice. He actually said that often, but that quote came from Theodore Parker, who was an abolitionist who he admired. And I think that is in fact true. But you have to couple that, because that is really an ethical, moral argument. And there is certainly an ethical and moral argument to be made for equity and inclusion in the workplace. But separate and apart from that, there really is a business case argument to be made. And when you combine those two, you realize that there is a certain inevitability about companies taking a more thoughtful, more systemic, and more sustained approach to these issues. And I think it'll be necessary for their survival. If you see your competitors not only being thoughtful about issues of equity and inclusion in the workplace, but also benefiting from it, then you have two choices: either follow suit and thrive, or do nothing and suffer the consequences. And I think that's what's going to happen for a lot of companies.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say that, with the question you were addressing, when there's backlash after the enthusiasm has died off and lasting changes weren't made, what we always recommend is, and there's another question about how long this will take. It's a journey. It's not a destination. It's an ongoing. It's like, you've heard about continuous improvement, right? We've all been through the different management schools and things, and so there's this idea of continuous improvement. And it really doesn't matter where you are today. Anything you do is an improvement. And one of the things I wanted to also mention is, as you talked about the inventory, the biggest part of that inventory is, how are your employees really feeling, right?
Yes.
I mean, people do surveys. They do surveys like once a year. Sometimes they do it more often. But that's not even enough, because when you do a survey, I mean, I think you should do it, right? Just to be clear, people should do it. If you're not doing it, you should start. If you are doing it, continue. But it's not enough on its own, because in a survey, you only know what people are thinking at that very moment they're answering that survey question, and only the questions you thought to ask them, right? You don't know what they're thinking 99% of the rest of their time and about 99% of the other topics. So you need some safe environment. You need to create a safe environment. We've had things come out, with our customers on our platform, where people talk about things that, they can post anonymously. It can be respectfully answered. Obviously, there's controls. But, companies go, oh, we didn't know we had this LGBTQ community in our company, and that they have concerns about their partner benefits and things like that. Well, you have to create that environment where those things come out, and you have to just bite what you can chew, right? We always say it's better to commit to a fewer things and go a little bit slower but make sure you do them, because this is an area, if you make commitments, if you say things and you don't follow through, there in fact can be backlash.
Well, Sonya, you are absolutely spot on. And one of the reasons for that is because of the fluidity, both in the workplace and the workforce. That's another thing that you see from, the younger generation entering the workforce. They tend to move around a little bit more. And so since you have that fluidity within the workforce, you have to constantly monitor and take the temperature for the workforce. And then, as we saw last year, situations affect people in so many different and fundamental ways. I just want to touch upon something you mentioned earlier, and there are a couple of questions in the chat about the timeline. Realistically, what's a timeline for D&I initiatives? Should companies be looking at year-long programs? And then someone asked a similar question: in your experience, how long can one realistically expect to make meaningful changes to the culture of a company? Here's what I'll say. Most companies, nonprofits, education institutions, whatever entity you have, if you were to ask them, they would say that, especially now, issues of inclusion and equity and diversity are core values of the company. They would also tell you that, let's say, ethics is a core value, okay? Nobody has an ethics guy come in once a year, give an ethics lecture, and then leave, and then you go about doing business in the usual unethical fashion, right? No, every single thing that you do from now until forever has to be guided by principles of ethics, of doing things within the boundaries of the law, okay? Well, if diversity and inclusion is also a core fundamental value, if it's in your DNA, then there's no magical timeline after which you don't have to be focused on this. Diversity and inclusion, if you think about it, diversity is about the workforce. Inclusion is about the workplace. Everything having to do with human resources, and this is the Human Resources Committee is putting this program on, is about the workforce and the workplace. So what that means is that you should always be concerned about these issues, and the work that you're doing should be ongoing, long-term, systemic, because there are always going to be issues with the workforce, always issues with the workplace. You present yourself in a very, I think, thoughtful, strategic, almost prophylactic fashion if you take a long-term strategic approach to these issues. There's no magic wand. I mean, we would like to think that there is. Thankfully, there's a COVID vaccine, but there is no diversity, inclusion, and equity vaccine. It is about making sure that you look at the organization, look at the workforce, look at the workplace, and be mindful of the things that make sure that there is an equitable, inclusive environment on an ongoing basis. Because let's face it, we're human beings, and that means that there's always going to be the need for us to be vigilant about these issues on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, that's so well said, Joe. I couldn't agree more. I do think as well, this is a long-term journey. Having said that, I also want people to feel hopeful that they can see that there are quick wins, right? If we do some things that Joe also recommended, and we also do with our clients, is measure, know where your low-hanging fruit are. You can. And I give you an anecdote. I mean, just like we were saying earlier about, listening to your employees. One of our clients, they had an issue where it can happen in a moment. That transformation can happen in a moment. In how you respond, how you have a tough conversation. There was a post on their platform, that somebody talked about LGBTQ benefits and kind of questioning the company why they were not available for same-sex partners. The company had earlier told us that they just don't really address LGBTQ issues or topics in general. That's just not in their culture and the culture of the region of the country where they are headquartered. And so when this came up, they had a moment. They called me. It was like, afterwards, actually, after the fact, because they had a choice to remove that. On our platform, you can remove a post if you just, it's inappropriate or something. There are some checks and things, but you can also do it manually. And they decided, they actually had a meeting whether or not to address it. And they decided, to their credit, that they would in fact address it, even though that wasn't something they openly usually talked about. So the HR, responded to it based on leadership direction. They basically said, we actually do have benefits for same-sex as well as heterosexual partners, as long as they're married couple, right? We just don't offer benefits to anyone who's not married, and this has been the case since 2015. So then the employee came out. They had posted anonymously initially, but then they came out with their name and they thanked the company and they said they were delighted to work for such a company. And then when that happened, the rest of the employees started reacting to the post and giving, responses and things. So this was in a span of about 24 hours. So the fact that they were able to actually genuinely listen and hear, there was a safe environment where somebody felt safe enough to at least, post anonymously, and that conversation occurred both in the leadership level. There was a change in the leadership perspective and attitude towards all of this. And then the whole organization, there was really a moment of cultural transformation. So I know people roll their eyes at these things. They go, yeah, cultural transformation, or any business transformation, right? And it's got to take forever. It is a journey, but there are, wins, there's successes along the way. And you have an opportunity, to act. And every decision you make, your customers, your employees, your shareholders are watching.
You're absolutely right, Sonya, and I'm so glad you mentioned that, because it even though there's no sort of magic wand, progress should be not just measured but reported. I mentioned earlier that those four things I mentioned: inventory, information, accountability in the business case. Use that information channel to share and communicate those wins and those victories. There's one company that I started doing work with last year after George Floyd, and one of the big challenges that they had was actually, they were very active with recruiting diverse talent, but attrition was a huge issue for them. And part of the reason is because there was, but they finally, through some of the work we were doing, they acknowledged and admitted this. There was a great deal of sort of implicit bias involved in the process of laying hands on the next generation of leadership and getting them over the finish line. And so we did we started with some implicit bias training, and then we looked at sort of the decision-making process that went into giving people the opportunities for growth and development. They didn't do any special favors, but what they did was they identified where those barriers were and eliminated them. And they've done a fantastic job with identifying, first of all, retaining the diverse talent that they brought in, and then identifying diamonds in the rough, fantastic leaders who they had overlooked and they hadn't taken the time to develop and provide opportunities for advancement. And that's changed, and their leadership profile has changed. And the people who are actually in leadership now are doing a fantastic job. So that's an example of, look, progress, once you actually get in and actually put the work in, is something that is measured, measurable, and should be shared and reported as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a few minutes left. We have many questions, so we will try and answer as many as we can here yet. But I also want to say, if you're okay, Joe, maybe we can share our contact information and on the answers here, so people could get in touch with us later. But I do want to give you some rapid fire questions, just to just mix it up a little bit here in the last few minutes, and then we'll go back to a couple of more questions. Your hero when you were a kid?
I'm sorry?
Your hero when you were a kid?
Oh, my parents. I mean, listen, I grew up in the Deep South, and both my parents grew up in a very thoroughly segregated South Louisiana, and there was so many challenges that I could not fathom. Despite that, they met when they were both in their sophomore year in college, finished college, and 2 graduate programs together, each of them, and raised 7 kids, and made sure that all of us finished college and at least 1 graduate or professional degree for each of us. And that in and of itself is an extraordinary accomplishment for that time and that place and that era. And so they're deceased now, but they each were my hero and heroine, if that term makes sense, when I was growing up and still to this day.
Awesome. Awesome. What are you reading now?
So there's a book that I would recommend to everyone. It's called The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee. It's an extraordinary book, and it to the point I made earlier about sort of like the collective ownership of the inclusion dynamic. It's very interesting. It actually gives a number of really searing anecdotes about how some of the decisions that were made from a governmental standpoint and institutional standpoint actually that were designed to impact African Americans actually had a deleterious impact on the entirety of society. One book that I'm rereading is The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, which I think talks about sort of like the connexity between the educational pipeline, the prison industrial complex, and its impact on communities of color in this country. I would recommend both of those books.
That's awesome. Your biggest fear?
You might have seen some evidence of it in the article that I wrote. For me, I don't really fear anything, to be frank with you. But the one thing that does keep me up nights is the same thing that kept my parents up nights, and it's concern for the well-being of my kids.
Yeah, awesome. Let's just answer one more question, if you don't mind. Somebody asked about basically, what they can do as an individual contributor, that people that are not in management, what can they do?
I think there's two things. One, develop your relationships internally and externally. Companies are very much attuned to peer pressure. And to the extent that you can connect with people at your same level in other companies that are doing it the right way or doing well, both from a moral, ethical standpoint and a business standpoint, and then share that information up the food chain, I think it'll help a lot.
Yeah, and I think somebody else asked that they have management that are not really taking any action, and they're not even putting any statements out, doing nothing. So, what can they do in this? How does a manager handle this when the senior leadership is not on board or doing anything?
Yeah, just continue to communicate up the food chain. I think eventually that will end up pollinating within the organization. And look, I've seen, I certainly wouldn't recommend anybody to leave the organization they're with, but I see people making decisions, companies, individuals making decisions based on what's best for them and the type of organization they want to be associated with.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that those are personal decisions, absolutely. But I think that there's a lot of options these days, right? I mean, people
Yes.
really know and feel that there's 9 million jobs that are open. If you feel like, I will add this too. I mean, if you feel like you're in a position where you don't have that many options because, your skills are not that much in demand, then it's time to upskill too, right? To be in demand. There's lots of opportunities out there. Look, it's we're on the hour. I want to keep us and be respectful of everyone's time. I know that we could go on. There's many more. Do you mind sharing? I mean, when we could do it in the chat, I'm not sure exactly how to do it. My contact info is just Sonya with a Y, Sonya at OurOffice.io. Happy to chat with anyone later on. And Joe, it's up to you. But and Caitlin, we share because there's many other questions we didn't get to, and I apologize for that.
Yeah, so I'm a partner at Duane Morris. My contact information is on Duane Morris's website.
Yes. Awesome.
Thank you both so much for sharing your time most generously and your insights and your expertise. And for all of our attendees, we will definitely send you that contact information as well in case you missed it. So I wanted to extend special thanks again to our committee, to Duane Morris, to OurOffice for being with us today. And also a quick shout out for our next upcoming FACC event. This time we'll be getting together in person. So if you're in New York City on August 19th, we'll be headed to the Bash Boutique in Nolita for a member mixer. We'd love to have you. And if you're not a member of the Chamber yet and you're interested in learning more about our events, please reach out to membership@FACC-NYC.org, where we can also tell you how we can support your business and help you grow and develop in the United States. So thank you everyone so much. And we hope you both have a great afternoon, great travels, vacation, the rest of your summer as well.
Thanks again. And thank you, Joe, again.
Thank you, Sonya.
Let's
Thank you,
have
Caitlin.
coffee in LA when you're here. Bye-bye.
Absolutely. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye,
Bye-bye.
everyone.